So I hope everyone has the handout. And then just finally, before I begin, I would just like to thank Mateusz for inviting me to speak and to co-organize this webinar series. It was a great honor to be invited to do so. And I'd also like to thank the Institute for Advanced Studies at Poznan and the Initiative of Excellence Research University Program for funding this series of events. And I think this is a fantastic program. I really hope that this will be the start of many fruitful collaborations between Polish scholars and international scholars, and particularly between the University of Nottingham and Poznan. So without further ado, I will begin. So my topic today is how to spot a tyrant. And I wish to begin this paper, and indeed this overall series on tyranny and its interactions with democracy, both ancient and modern, with a quotation from the political scientist Leo Strauss. Now, this is the beginning of his work On Tyranny, the first edition of which was published in 1948 and was the first book he wrote in English. Now, as a German Jewish immigrant, first to Britain and then to the United States, Strauss, like others in his generation and from his background, knew something of the nature of modern tyranny, especially as it manifested itself in the 1930s and 40s Germany. Yet his book is in fact a commentary on an ancient text, Xenophon's Hieron, or Tyrannikos. Now, Strauss justified his subject matter thus, and here I'd like to turn your attention to the first passage on your handout. So he states, I quote, "Tyranny is a danger coeval with political life. The analysis of tyranny is therefore as old as political science itself. The analysis of tyranny that was made by the first political scientists was so clear, so comprehensive, and so unforgettably expressed that it was remembered and understood by generations which did not have any direct experience of actual tyranny. On the other hand, when we were brought face to face with tyranny, with a kind of tyranny that surpassed the boldest imagination of the most powerful thinkers of the past, our political science failed to recognize it. It is not surprising, then, that many of our contemporaries, disappointed or repelled by present-day analyses of present-day tyranny, were relieved when they rediscovered the pages in which Plato and other classical thinkers seem to have interpreted for us the horrors of the 20th century. Excuse me. He then goes on to emphasize that, and I quote, "One cannot understand modern tyranny in its specific character before one has understood the elementary and, in a sense, natural form of tyranny, which is pre-modern tyranny. This basic stratum of modern tyranny remains, for all practical purposes, unintelligible to us if we do not have recourse to the political science of the classics." This lecture series is fundamentally Straussian in the questions it poses, although perhaps not always in the answers to those questions. And I should answer that it is possible that there may be much disagreement and fruitful debate between contributors. I certainly hope so. And I should also say that what I present here are only my own views. So my opening hypothesis, which we will put to the test in this and subsequent lectures, is that a full understanding of the nature of modern tyranny in the 20th and 21st centuries does indeed require an understanding of the form of tyranny known to the Greeks, who were themselves the ones who gave us the word tyranny, the first to describe and the first to analyze this particular form of government. Knowledge of ancient political philosophy is not, of course, as Strauss emphasized himself, sufficient for an understanding of modern non-democratic regimes, which differ in significant ways, but it is an important prerequisite. Our approach, to some extent, also differs from that of Strauss, since many of the contributors to this series, including myself, are classicists and ancient historians, not primarily political scientists, although there are some important exceptions to that. It is further suggested here, therefore, that the study of ancient history and philosophy, specifically on tyranny, can be enriched in turn by the study of modern political science and by comparative research on modern dictatorships, on which far more substantial data is available. Classicists have not been averse to comparative approaches in other fields within our subject, and most notably, I think, the best example is the study of ancient slavery. But there has been, as far as I am aware, no systematic attempt to apply modern data and the methodologies of modern political science to the subject of ancient tyranny. Now, the time is ripe, I argue, for such an analysis, since a vast amount of empirical data on 20th century authoritarian regimes has been gathered since Strauss's time. And particularly significant are the data sets and measures of personalism developed in particular by Geddes, Wright, and France, and by Magaloni, Chu, and Min. And I draw your attention to the references on the handout. Now, Strauss had complained that, and this is handout quotation 2, a social science that cannot speak of tyranny with the same confidence with which medicine speaks, for example, of cancer, cannot understand social phenomena as what they are. Present-day social science finds itself in this condition. In 2021, we need not be anything like as pessimistic. It is thus as much the purpose of this series to encourage ancient historians to consider comparative approaches to their subject, as it is to encourage political scientists to revisit classical texts, such as those of Plato and Xenophon. Now, this series will attempt to revisit many of our assumptions concerning tyranny, both ancient and modern, from a variety of perspectives. Now, I hope I won't put you off too much in this lecture, so I do want to assure you now that we have an absolutely stellar lineup for you. So in the next lecture, Edward Harris will consider how tyranny and the desire of the Greeks to prevent the accumulation of power led to the creation of concepts and institutions related to the rule of law. Tyranny thus cannot be studied on its own, but must be seen as a possible alternative to other forms of constitution, most notably democracy. But then, of course, the same is true of democracy. We cannot understand democracy fully without understanding tyranny. Therefore, this series is also as much concerned with tyranny as it is with its interrelations with democracy, how democracies emerge from dictatorships and descend into tyranny, and how democracies negotiate and interact with tyrannies. James Kierstead will thus consider the concept of isagoria, often translated as free or equal speech, and its importance in differentiating free societies from tyrannies, and a key reason for the success of democracies. So Andrew Hansen and Robert Fleck will consider the processes by which tyrannies give way to democracies and vice versa in both archaic Greece and the modern world. Mirko Canavaro addresses the problem of honor or respect in tyrannical polities and the tendency of tyrants to monopolize honor, resulting in dysfunctional economies of esteem. Elodie Paillard, on the other hand, will examine the role of tyrants as patrons of art and literature, specifically tragedy, and the reasons why they often embark on extensive public artistic programs. Finally, Xavier Marquez and Josh Ober will conclude each semester with reflections on how the classical world has influenced our modern understanding of tyranny and dictatorship, and how techniques developed in modern social science can be used to further illuminate the history of ancient despotism. However, I begin today with a simple question, or perhaps I should say a deceptively simple question. What is a tyrant? How do you spot one? If we are to study tyranny, we must know what it is that we are looking for. And my overall hypothesis is that it is possible to spot a tyrant objectively and empirically, just as it is possible to identify cancer in a patient, to borrow Strauss's analogy. I also argue that what the Greeks called tyranny also exists in other periods of history, in particular the 20th and 21st centuries AD. The Greek word tyrannis is not an equivalent to all regimes identified today by political scientists as authoritarian or non-democratic, which include regime types that the ancients would most probably have identified as oligarchies. Excuse me. Nor were ancient regimes necessarily totalitarian. The capacity, though not necessarily the ambitions, of rulers to monopolize resources, information, and power were significantly limited by inferior technology in the ancient world. The form of tyranny that the Greeks of antiquity would have recognized most easily, however, is what modern political scientists have termed personalist dictatorship. That is, regimes ruled by individuals who have sufficiently monopolized power so as to be relatively unrestrained in its exercise, and who in many cases have also developed strong personality cults to justify their rule. My thesis, which will require further time and research to demonstrate, is that when one considers closely the examples of those who have achieved high levels of personal power, those whom Marquez describes as, I quote, the most colorful and morbidly entertaining images of non-democratic rule, which might include Stalin, Mao, Idi Amin, Gaddafi, and others, that when one considers these examples, it is impossible not to recognize that the portrait of the tyrannical soul in Plato's Republic 9 is fundamentally true to life, and, as Plato in fact hints, based on actual observation of real tyrants, and moreover, that Plato's tyrannical man can and does, in fact, exist. But returning to our core question, what is a tyrant? Strauss identified a key problem in modern approaches to this issue. And unfortunately, I do not seem to have put this quotation on the handout, but anyway, I shall read it out. Our political science is haunted by the belief that value judgments are inadmissible in scientific considerations, and to call a regime tyrannical clearly amounts to pronouncing a value judgment. The political scientist who accepts this view of science will speak of mass state, of dictatorship, of totalitarianism, of authoritarianism, and so on. And as a citizen, he may wholeheartedly condemn these things. But as a political scientist, he is forced to reject the notion of tyranny as mythical. Now, for Strauss, this approach to the study of autocracy had its beginning in modern thought with Machiavelli. It is stated, perhaps most clearly, by Thomas Hobbes in his Leviathan of 1651. In chapter 19, Hobbes adopted the tripartite division of classical writers for constitutions, that is, into monarchies, aristocracies, and democracies. He added, however, that, and this is passage on your handout number 3, there be other names of government in the histories and books of policy as tyranny and oligarchy, but they are not the names of other forms of government, but of the same forms misliked, for they are discontented under monarchy. They that are discontented under monarchy call it tyranny, and they that are displeased with aristocracy call it oligarchy. And here I might note Mateusz's comment about everyone calling what they don't like tyranny, I think is really quite relevant. In other words, we only call a regime tyranny when we are making a value judgment. And this tendency to avoid value judgments is perhaps observable in classical scholarship in tyrannies. Note perhaps the preference in some quarters for the words autocracy or monarchy or rule when describing regimes that the Greeks would have called either tyrannides or basileia. Examples might include for the titles of Nino Larragi's 2013 edited volume, The Splendors and Miseries of Ruling Alone, Encounters with Monarchy, or Lynette Mitchell's 2013 monograph, The Heroic Rulers of Archaic and Classical Greece. And the Greek philosophers, most particularly Plato, Xenophon, and Aristotle, however, observed a clear distinction between their word for tyrant, tyrannos, and king, basileus. An early example is provided by Thucydides, and this is handout passage 4. And here I quote Hobbes's 1629 translation, which demonstrates, if nothing else, that he was far from unaware of such a distinction in ancient thought. So I quote, "But when the power of Greece was now improved, and the desire of money withal, their revenues being enlarged, in most cities there were erected tyrannies. For before that time, kingdoms with honours limited were hereditary, and the Grecians built navies and became more seriously addicted to the affairs of the sea." Now here Thucydides clearly thinks of tyranny as something different, and moreover a later innovation, from kinship or basileia. We will return to this passage shortly. Now, ancient authors were also far from shy in making value judgments. All ancient authorities from at least the 5th century are unanimous in characterizing tyranny as the worst possible form of constitution. Modern scholars have often supposed that this negative view of tyranny was a later development, connected in particular to the flourishing of Athenian democracy in the 5th century BC. I have argued elsewhere in a 2021 article published in Polis and a forthcoming study of the concept of tyranny and tragedy, that this view is misguided. In actual fact, the underlying assumptions of Plato differed little from earlier writers, including Pindar and Herodotus, the latter of whom has a character, the Corinthian Socrates, called tyranny most unjust and bloodstained. While there is not space to develop that argument here, I would note briefly that no ruler in the classical or archaic periods ever called himself, or is addressed directly as, a tyrant, though Pindar does imply that his patron Hieron of Syracuse belongs to a broader category called tyrants. Characters in drama, particularly those of lower status, such as slaves or messengers, are also shy of addressing rulers as tyrants. There is not one instance in all of extant 5th century tragedy of a character employing the vocative address tyrane when speaking directly to a ruler, and generally characters avoid any use of words associated with tyrannis in the presence of a ruler. The one exception that proves the rule comes in the Rhesus. This is a play attributed to Euripides, but most probably a 4th century composition. And in this example, the brash and arrogant Rhesus hails Hector as tyrant. Now, it may be significant that in the following scene, the two do not exactly get on. This tendency both for ancient philosophers to distinguish between tyrants and kings, and to pronounce value judgments, may be part of the reason why students of ancient philosophy have been, for the most part, less than inclined to take what they have to say at face value. Just to give a few examples here, in an introduction to Plato's Republic of 1981, the influential philosopher Julia Annas argued that Plato's description of the tyrannical soul was highly implausible. Such a ruler, she opined, would, and I quote, not last a week. And significantly, she justified this conclusion with modern historical parallels, particularly Hitler and Stalin. Plato's tyrant, in the view of Annas, was an imaginary character, created for purely philosophical purposes. Marcel Mulder, in an article of 1989, similarly doubted whether Plato's tyrant could be a model for any single ancient historical tyrant. In the latest study on tyranny in the Republic, Cinzia Ruzza again argues that, and I quote, Plato's critique of tyranny is not a critique of actual tyrannical regimes. This may seem surprising, given that Plato had first-hand experience of at least one tyranny, that of the elder Dionysius, and then later on that of his son. And at the conclusion of Republic 9, moreover, Socrates suggests that final judgment on tyranny must be left to one who has actually studied a tyrant at first hand. It is reasonable, I suggest, to suppose that Plato here may be alluding to himself. Either way, Aristotle, Plato's pupil, certainly had a wealth of information on actual tyrannies contained in the constitutional handbooks produced by his school, and yet he has not received much better treatment. Alfred Huyss, in an article of 1971, for example, identified aspects of Aristotle's description of tyranny that were similar to modern totalitarianism, but argued that there was no evidence for such regimes in antiquity. As Ivan Yordovich has claimed, and this is handout passage number 5, the usefulness of Aristotle as a source for the historical phenomenon of ancient Greek tyranny is severely limited. Again, I believe such a response is misguided. To understand why our ancient authorities took the view they did of tyranny, we need to understand how they defined a tyrannis. An initial reading of our text, though, does admittedly prove a little disappointing. So consider this passage from Xenophon's Memorabilia, which is handout 6. So kingship and despotism, which is basileian dekai tyrannida, in Socrates' judgment, were both forms of government, but he held that they differed. For government of men with their consent and in accordance with the laws of the state was kingship, while government of unwilling subjects and not controlled by laws, but imposed by the will of the ruler, was despotism, that is, tyrannis, tyranny. This definition is not, in fact, very helpful, because it only identifies two characteristics that sometimes apply to regimes that are called tyrannical, that is, illegitimate rule on the one hand and unpopular rule on the other. But it doesn't really tell us what tyranny actually is. This becomes apparent if we consider whether tyrannies are always illegitimate and unpopular. Ancient authorities such as Thucydides did in fact believe that tyrants, such as Pisistratus, could at times act in accordance with the laws. And can all subjects of tyrants be unwilling all of the time? Herodotus actually indicates that Pisistratus, in his final campaign to capture Athens, received support from some Athenians who, Herodotus says, loved tyranny more than freedom, and he explicitly uses here the word tyrannis. This is in accord, actually, with the views of Plato in the Republic, who describes the creation of the tyrant as due largely to the drones. These are the vicious and idle elements in the populace who become tyrant makers in order to satisfy their own desires. And yet Socrates' definition, as presented by Xenophon, while overly simplistic, is far from without elements of truth, I would suggest. What is not expressed, I think, is the fact that the tyranny described as illegitimate and unpopular is not true of every tyranny, but is true of an ideal of tyranny. Xenophon has in mind not any tyranny, but tyranny in its complete and developed form. In fact, illegitimate and unpopular rule are to all tyrannies. Moreover, implicit in Xenophon's description of the ideal of tyranny is an awareness that tyrannies change over time, that they gradually come more and more to exhibit the characteristics of the ideal or complete tyranny. I will justify this claim briefly by a consideration of Plato's description of the rise of the tyrant in Republic 8. So even though Plato believed that the soul of the tyrant was entirely corrupt, in the Republic he nonetheless assumes a gradual process of moral decay. He does not require all tyrants to be equally immoral to fit his schema, but rather suggests that they are embarked on and have reached various stages along a common road to perdition. Even if tyrants occasionally perform civilized or virtuous acts, it would be wrong on this basis to assume that tyranny can be a civilizing or virtuous institution. The discussion of tyranny forms part of a wider explanation of how the ideal city might decline through the successive stages of timocracy, oligarchy, and democracy, For Plato, tyranny was the final stage in the perversion of the state after democracy, and develops out of strife between the demos and the rich. The tyrannical soul of Republic 9 appears so incredible to some scholars. Andrews, for example, characterizes Plato's tyrant as a pantomime ogre. So it appears so incredible because Plato's tyrant is explicitly a vision of the worst person possible. However, that person is the result of a gradual process of corruption, progressing over the lifetime of the tyrant and tyranny, what I term in my 2021 article, the tyrant's progress. The tyrant's progress starts from seemingly good intentions as a representative of the people. Plato thus assumes that the tyrant is popular at first, or rather that the popular leader is a nascent tyrant. And here I draw your attention to handout number 7. So Socrates here says, this is clear then, that whenever a tyrant sprouts up, he is rooted in the role of popular representative and no other. And Adeimantus replies, it is clear indeed. And Socrates says, what then is the beginning of the change from popular representative to tyrant? So what we can see here is a metaphor of growth in nature, where the tyrant grows up like a plant from a root, which emphasizes that this is a gradual change. There is a distinction between the neophyte and complete tyrant. Plato indeed conceives of multiple stages in the tyrant's development that are reached in succession if the aspiring ruler is not killed in the attempt. One of these stages is the request for a bodyguard, which Plato tells us all those who have progressed to this point discover. The finished tyrant only comes about once he has been exiled and has successfully returned. Then, when his power is complete, he appears transformed from popular representative into tyrant. And yet, even at this late stage, Plato still distinguishes between the early days, when there is still some pretense of popular rule, and the undisguised despot at the final stage of development. And this, I would draw your attention to passage 8 on the handout. So Socrates says, then surely in the early days and for some time afterwards, he will smile at and greet all who happen upon him. And he will say that he is not a tyrant and promise many things, both in private and public. And he abolishes debt and distributes land to the people and those around him, and pretends to be gracious and mild to all. Yet all of this, of course, is a front and an act, since he is now truly become a tyrant. Plato's tyrant may not make any very serious attempt at virtue. On the other hand, evil is not a fundamental part of his nature. Rather, he is gradually corrupted by his position. The rise of tyranny follows partly from decisions taken under previous constitutions. So it was necessary, it was a necessary consequence of democracy that freedom was taken to such excessive lengths that the constitution was transformed into tyranny. Similarly, Plato adopts the myth of the cult of Lycaean Zeus, where those who taste human blood are necessarily transformed into wolves. And this emphasizes that the tyrant's savagery is an inevitable result of the initial killings that saw him rise to power. And this is handout 9, where Socrates says, then in this way, what follows is surely necessary, again, ananker, and he is doomed either to die at the hands of his enemies or to be a tyrant, tyrannein, and to become like a wolf instead of a man. So the tyrant is unable to live in peace, even if he wishes to do so. The need to justify his rule and impoverish and thereby distract his people leads him to carry on wars against other cities, which will ultimately be unpopular. Similarly, it is a fear of retribution that will force him to rely on slaves and foreign mercenaries and to distrust and plot against good citizens, again, whether he wants to or not. Eta buletai, eta mer. He ends, therefore, in enslaving the demos and is, in consequence, hated and feared by his people. But Plato does not state that this was his initial intention. In a similar way, the soul of the tyrant is at least initially the passive creation of those tyrant makers, tyrannopoioi. This crucial insight that tyrannies change in their nature over time is vindicated to some extent by studies of modern dictatorships, such as that of Geddes, France, and Wright. Now, modern political scientists frequently recognize that the behavior of dictators depends in part on relations between the tyrant and his inner circle. Dictatorships change in their nature, at least in part, according to the extent to which a leader is able to personalize or monopolize power, and so loosen the hold regime elites and other interest groups have over him. The personalization of power, in turn, has potential negative effects on the behavior of rulers and regimes. So highly personalist regimes have been shown, for example, to be more belligerent and to be more likely to use violence to crush dissent, even than other authoritarian regimes. So it's no coincidence that the regimes of Gaddafi in Libya and the Assad family in Syria were considerably more personalist under most measures than neighboring regimes such as those in Tunisia or Egypt, that were similarly affected by the events of the Arab Spring from 2010 and 2011. Similarly, in the minds of ancient theorists, the common factor, I suggest, that allows us to define tyrants is the monopolization of power and the good things in the polis. So it's not just power, of course, it's also honors and wealth, etc., etc. In addition, ancient philosophers further believed that the monopolization of power was the root cause of the gradual corruption to which all tyrants are subject over time. The family resemblances of tyrants are thus symptoms of a common malady, which is the monopolization of power. Thus, ancient philosophers were able to both conceive of tyranny as a distinct constitution from other forms of rule and to apply a value judgment to it, since power corrupts, as Lord Acton famously noted. Now, to justify this claim that ancient authorities supposed the monopolization of power as a key criterion for identifying a tyrant, let us briefly consider a few examples. First, we have already seen that Thucydides defined kingship, basileia, in contrast to tyrannis, as hereditary rule with defined privileges. And the Greek there is epireatois gerasi patrikai basileia in passage 4, which we've already looked at. A perfect example of this kind of kingship is the Spartan diarchy, of course, where the double kings were granted specific and limited privileges. Similarly, for Aristotle, tyrannical behavior was not a key characteristic of tyrannies, since he suggests that tyrants can maintain their power by making their rule more kingly, and this is passage 10 on the handout. For just as one way of undermining a kingship, Aristotle says, is to make the rule more like that of a tyranny, so that is tyrannico-teran, so the salvation of tyranny is to make it more kingly, basilico-teran, with one reservation, which is power. It is necessary for this to remain on principle, but for the rest he should do some things and seem to do others in a play act of a king. So here Aristotle indicates that the one thing that defines the kingly tyrant as still a tyrant is power, not his behavior. This interpretation also suits those passages where ancient authors compare other regimes to tyrannies, even when they are not strictly tyrannies. And a good example of this is the speech of the oligarch Critias, handout number 11. Now, Critias was the leader of the so-called 30 tyrants who took over Athens in 4043. They were called the 30 tyrants, but they were, of course, an oligarchy established by Sparta. So, according to Xenophon, Critias says to his colleague Theramenes, "But if," he said, Merely because we are 30 and not 1, you imagine that it is any the less necessary for us to keep a close watch over this government, just as one would if it were an absolute monarchy, but actually this is a translation of the Greek, which is hos per tyrannidos. You are foolish. So the translation here and the lower translation of absolute monarchy is actually unnecessary here. What Xenophon says is tyranny, but again, this appears to be contrary to modern sensibilities. But the link between absolute power and stereotypical tyrannical behavior, the murder of opponents, paranoia, sexual deviancy, etc., is also evident in our ancient sources, as we have seen in our discussion of Plato's Republic. Studies such as Lavelle's 2005 monograph entitled Fame, Money and Power, The Rise of Pisistratus and Democratic Tyranny at Athens, this study misses the crucial distinction between behavior and power. Lavelle is right to argue that the behavior of Pisistratus is not dissimilar to the behavior of later statesmen under the democracy, but he is wrong to suppose that such a thing as democratic tyranny can therefore exist. This is because a tyrant is not defined on the basis of behavior, but on power relations, which in turn affects behavior. So, if the monopolization of power is our key consideration when defining tyrannies, how then can we measure the personalization of power? Now, this is not a question I can answer now, because I simply do not yet have an answer. And a measure for personalism for the ancient world, similar to that, for example, developed by Barbara Geddes and her colleagues, is at present lacking. But I can at least now suggest some possibilities for what such a measure of personalism would look like. Key criteria might include the ease by which rulers are able to exile rivals, the corresponding inability of political opponents to similarly exile rulers and their supporters, the frequency with which key allies and members of a ruler's family hold office, instances in which foreign powers appear to negotiate and deal directly with the ruler and not other factions within the polity, or the ability of rulers to dominate citizen assemblies or public festivals. Such a measure of personalism would allow us to more objectively define the difference between tyrants and those who are simply called tyrants. Now, consider briefly the question, was Pericles a tyrant at Athens? Now, this may perhaps appear a foolish question, because what I'm essentially doing is asking whether Athenian democracy was in fact a tyranny. But nonetheless, stay with me. It might be prompted by Thucydides' famous claim that Athens under Pericles was, while nominally a democracy, that it was in fact the rule of the first citizen. And that's in book 2, 65-9. And yet, if we applied a measure of personalism, such as that outlined just now, Pericles would not score highly. For one thing, the context of this passage is a serious challenge made by the populace to Pericles' handling of the war. Thucydides admits at 265-3 that the Athenians did not accept Pericles' policy until they had actually fined him. And Pericles was only ever ultimately one general out of 10, although he was the most senior of those generals and was regularly elected. And while Pericles on occasion benefited from the exile of opponents under the system of ostracism, such as Cimon and Thucydides, son of Milesius, he could not entirely control who was ostracized. Indeed, many of his friends appear to have been driven out of Athens, and this is especially made clear in the account provided by Plutarch. All of these limits of power allow us to firmly conclude, surprise, surprise, that Pericles was not a tyrant. But let's try a more difficult case, such as Dion, son of Hipporenus of Syracuse. Dion was the brother-in-law of the tyrant Dionysius I, so the one who invited Plato to Syracuse. And Dion also married Dionysius's daughter. He was thus clearly a member of the inner circle of the regime. He was exiled by Dionysius' son, also called Dionysius, in 366, shortly after his father's death, and probably in part as a means to strengthen his rule and remove a potential rival. Dion returned in 357, and in a daring coup eventually overthrew Dionysius. He was granted the title of General Plenipotentiary, that is, Strategos Autokrator, the same title, incidentally, as that held by the elder Dionysius. And not only that, but he also executed a potential rival, Heraclides. This bare presentation of the facts might suggest that we are dealing here with a tyrant, and indeed some ancient authorities and contemporaries clearly saw Dion as such. But we should leave aside the question of whether Dion intended or desired to be a tyrant and focus merely on whether he can be said to have achieved it. The answer appears to be no. As Sean Lewis has recently argued in the volume Tyranny, New Directions, which came out earlier this year, one of the signs that Dion was not a tyrant is that he failed, or perhaps did not attempt, to dominate the assembly. And this enabled the election of Heraclides as admiral, or nauarch, which in turn meant that Dion's authority was limited. And rather than using his mercenaries to quell dissent in Syracuse, Dion was in fact unable to persuade the Syracusans to pay them, which led to Dion's temporary withdrawal from the city. So, finally, to conclude, I have argued this evening for the need to develop a means of measuring the monopolization or personalism of power, which will enable a reassessment of our ancient evidence for tyranny. By being able to spot tyrants in the ancient world more objectively, we will be able to gain a better understanding of how tyranny functioned in antiquity. I have argued, although I cannot prove my thesis, that at present, that actual tyrannies in antiquity can in fact be understood using the models developed by Plato, Aristotle, and others, because they were themselves based on the actual experience of those tyrannies. Further vindication of this argument may be provided by comparative studies of data on modern regimes. This will show, I hope, moreover, that the value judgments of ancient authors concerning tyranny were justified. The broader significance of such a conclusion is that, as Leo Strauss argued, study of tyranny should indeed begin with the classics, and that tyranny is a cross-temporal and cross-cultural pattern of behavior that can be objectively described and, to some extent, predicted. And there I will conclude. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Edmund, for this fascinating and lucid lecture. And now we have time for questions and for a discussion. So probably you all know the drill, but of course with this number of participants, it would be best for someone who wants to ask a question or make a comment to raise his or her hand by using the proper icon. That's the third from the left above the images of the speaker. You have three. You have list of participants, then you have a chat, and then you have a selection of reactions. And if you raise your hand, I will give you the floor, or alternatively, you can just turn on your camera if you are unable to find the raised hand. So, well, I open the floor for discussion. Oh, I'm seeing something. Okay, so the first person to ask a question, make a comment, is Malcolm Lowe. So please turn on your camera if it's possible, and your microphone.
I turned on the microphone. If you can hear me,
Yes, we can. Is it possible to turn your camera as well?
On my computer, it sometimes it takes up too much power. So
okay. So, but we can hear you. So
well, I just want to draw attention to two other details in Aristotle's account, which I think are, well, two or three, in fact, which are very significant, because one is, I think, about the passage that you quoted. He says there are actually two kinds of tyrants. I'm sure you know this passage, but and he says the one thing they have in common is that they make sure that they have control. They have their own security, and they have control. But in every other respect, they differ. The second kind of tyrant doesn't live in luxurious circumstances here, but on the contrary, emphasizes, his relative poverty. He doesn't put people to death arbitrarily, and so on and so forth. And of course, we can think of such examples. A second point he makes, which is very important, is to say that the appearance and the reality of a constitution can be different. And so, for example, if we take the 5th century democracy in Athens, one could argue that in some ways it was more like an oligarchy than a democracy, although it had the forms of a democracy. And also, with regard to its allies, it was, in fact, it became a tyranny quite clearly. I mean, that the way they treated Samos and other places, Mytilene and so on, and of course, Milos, of course, is another example. So, so it was a tyranny in respect to his allies, which I think in the long term was the loss of Athens, because whereas Rome expanded its citizenship gradually to include other cities and so on, and its allies, Athens' refusal to do this, I think, was also one of the causes of the collapse of its empire in the long run. So I would say, so these subtle points. Another, of course, and the final one more he makes is, he says sometimes what is most important, Aristotle, is what is most important is not the form of government, which is one of these three, but whether the government proceeds according to laws which everybody obeys, including both the powerful and the weak. So.
Yes, well, thank you very much for that. Yeah, that really does bring out very nicely some points which I didn't have time or felt I couldn't go into in more detail. But yeah, it's a nice point about Athenian democracy being compared to a tyranny, and again, what is the thing that they're what is, and it seems a very strange thing to say, as that Pericles says in Thucydides. Our rule is essentially a tyranny. But then why is he saying that? Well, he's saying it because we have total and arbitrary power over we have the ability to treat our allies in any way we like, in the same way that a master has the ability to treat a slave in any way he likes. And of course, you can treat a slave well and fairly, or you have the power to kill your slave, and everything in between, if you like. So I think it's the same thing with tyranny, exactly as you put it. I have the power. Having the power to be able to treat people badly doesn't mean that you will. On the other hand, it's more likely that you will. Human beings being what they are, they do often give in to these temptations. So yeah, no, thank you very much for bringing up those additional passages.
thank you. The next question or a comment? So in the meantime, while you're thinking about possible questions to Edmund, I wanted to ask you about Plato, because if I understood your argument correctly, you don't think that Plato's attitude towards understanding tyranny is correct, because he is focused basically on the internal psychology of the tyrant. And but do you think it's not fruitful because it's too complicated, we need too much evidence, and we should prefer the criteria which are more accessible in order to make a judgment whether something is a tyranny or not? Or you just reject Plato's approach to court, but because that's the pivotal element of Plato's analysis. I mean, that correspondence between the government or the constitution and the internal character or psychological dynamics of basically every citizen in democracy, oligarchy, and all of it. So what is your position on Plato's approach?
Well, I don't reject Plato's approach at all. I think that the only problem is that Plato obviously has very different, in the Republic and other texts, has very different aims to us, where we want to know what tyrants are, and we want to know to be able to use the text as historians, whereas he obviously has his own philosophical agenda. But I think the main point I want to make is that I think Plato does have a very good knowledge of what tyranny is, and it is a knowledge which is based on the reality, historical realities, rather than a philosophical invention. So in that sense, I don't reject Plato's position at all. I think it's broadly correct. But where I suppose I think we need to go further is that obviously Plato he wants to create this ideal of the worst possible person. Of course, we can accept in historical reality that that not everyone, and the point is that I think a lot of people have missed, is that Plato does accept in the historical reality that people are not, people don't always exactly conform to this ideal. But I think the other point that has been missed is that Plato believes that Plato's schema, while it seems too narrow to deal with these exceptions and exceptions to his rule, is actually much broader. It can actually take in those exceptions, because he believes that tyrants are progressing in the same direction. They just haven't all reached the same sort of bottom of depravity, if that makes sense.
Well, and one could argue that the tyrant in Book 9 is not really the worst possible individual, because in the Book 2, Plato gives the ideal image of the worst person, the one who possesses the ring of Gyges. And this is obviously what no living tyrant can have, at least not yet. So the absolute safety from all possible consequences of his behavior, this will make the tyrannical soul the sort of idea of the tyrant, while in Book 9 he seems to speak about real historical instances or figures of very corrupted rulers, right?
But I think the Ring of Gyges is an interesting example, because one, it sort of goes back to the Gorgias, where in the Gorgias we're sort of told, what would be the most fortunate person, and the most fortunate person would be able to treat anyone as he likes and get away with it. And Polus in the Gorgias says that this person is essentially a tyrant, and he gives the example of Archelaus, the king of Macedon. So I think, and Gyges in the Republic is essentially that person, the person who's able to do injustice without any suffering any consequences, because he's invisible. And also, Gyges is an interesting example because one thinks, for example, of Archilochus, and Archilochus's poem where he says, I don't want the wealth of Gyges. I don't want to be as great as the gods. I don't want tyranny. So there again, Gyges is connected with tyranny. And I think the reason for that is that Gyges was a fabulously wealthy ruler. And he's also a Lydian ruler. So he's obviously much more wealthy than any Greek ruler was at the time. And notice again the connection between wealth is brought up by Thucydides as well, and also Tyrannos is potentially a non-Greek, is a borrowed word from Luwian and Hittite. So it's essentially a word sort of used by the Greeks, borrowed of the Greeks, to describe an Oriental type of monarchy of fabulous wealth, wealth that's almost up there as the gods. So in a sense, I would say that, you know, Gyges is a tyrant is like Gyges. I think there isn't so much of a difference between book 2 and book 9.
Thank you. Okay, anyone has a question? I can't see any hands.
Maybe I could say one more thing. Perhaps you could contrast the 5th century and the 4th century democracy in Athens. It seems to me that the 4th century democracy as a political system was a great improvement on the 5th century democracy. And indeed, because Athenians realized they understood some of the deficiencies of the 5th century democracy and attempted to correct them. And I wonder also whether, in fact, the death and the trial or the mistrial of Socrates was even a factor in this change, because we know that afterwards the Athenians were regretful and even put on trial his accusers and so on. And in the 4th century democracy, although there were also abuses of power by individual politicians, it seems to be one of the best places you could live in at that particular time. Whereas in the 5th century democracy, despite all the cultural achievements and so on, the political life was I would say, less agreeable.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. Thank you. I mean, I think to some extent the political life in 4th century Athens was still pretty difficult. I mean, I suppose, I mean, people like Aeschines, I suppose, he wasn't executed, but he still went into exile, and I suppose people like Conon and Timotheus, they didn't have it very easy all of the time. But yeah, I think that there is a lot in what you were saying. I think in some ways we do seem to have a mellowing, perhaps, of Athenian democracy. And one of the things I think is very interesting is the way that Athens seems to be become a lot less belligerent, a lot less prepared to go to war, and there may be a lot of complex reasons for that. But it does seem to be a major change from what we find in the 560s and 460s, 450s, and 430s. So yeah, I think there is something in what you're saying, and I think it is a sign that, you know, constitutions do change in their nature, and people in states change as a result.
Okay. Oh, I can see the raised hand, but I can't see name, only oh, yeah. So perhaps you could introduce yourself, sir.
Sorry, Christopher Tuplin. The thing about 4th century Athens surely is that, and it kind of fits your general point, is that it lacked the capacity to be belligerent. I mean, it lacked the money, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, as a political community, there are many ways in which one might say it looks like a more kind of balanced and reasonable way of doing democracy. But if you were a strategos, you were in significant danger of ending up dead if you didn't achieve what the state wanted. It's quite a dangerous thing to be prominent in that system. It may have, from certain points of view, procedurally, look a bit more balanced and sensible, but its capacity to take its revenge on political leaders who hadn't delivered the goods was just as untrammeled as before, and maybe more inclined to be enacted, if only because failure was more likely. I mean, 4th century Athens is a failed tyrant, in your terms. It lacks the agency and power to be untrammeled. But
Yeah.
it hates that fact like hell, and it takes it out on political leaders who have the misfortune to fail. So
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, Malcolm's point is it's a good point to think with, but and I think it does actually. I mean, in a sense, it helps your general point. I mean, another thought occurs to me. I mean, I like the idea that you should come down to brass tacks, and that what defines the tyrant is the capacity to do stuff, whatever you want. And I wonder, I mean, not for Straussian reasons, but to go back to Xenophon's Hiero in those terms, and to Simonides' attempt to suggest there is a way for Hiero to be a tyrant that will somehow be nice for him, will work. I mean, the interesting question is whether what Simonides suggests amounts to insisting on ways of retaining actual agency, come what may, while palliating the appearance of that. So it's not really about Hiero behaving differently. It's about packaging autocratic power differently. I mean, I tend to think that the point of the Hiero is kind of to suggest to the reader that you're on a hiding to nothing trying to do that. But still, I mean, in terms of your argument, it might be an interesting test case.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're entirely right. I mean, it does seem, I mean, it's clear that Hiero can't give up any power. Partly because, I mean, he's saying, "Oh, I hate being a tyrant." It's like, well, why don't you stop being a tyrant? Well, I can't give it up. So Simonides is you're right. He's not changing anything to do with that. I mean, it's things like, for example, making the bodyguards of the tyrant actually turn into a police force who are useful for the populace. And I think this is typical of also what we find, for example, in Isocrates' orations to Nicocles as well, and also what Plato says about his aims in the 7th letter, that what these people are trying to do is they're trying to ameliorate, to make life better for the people under tyranny by improving the tyrant, by making him more a more benevolent figure. But yes, in a sense, to turn the tyrant into, make him, as Aristotle would say, sort of basilikotera, teros, rather. So I think that is the main aim. Although I still think it's significant that Simonides, when he's actually talking about how Hierone can be can be a happier ruler, doesn't really use the word tyrant, except when he's talking about negative things which Hierone is going to avoid. So in a sense, I think Simonides is trying to show here on how not to be a tyrant, or to be less of a tyrant, while yes, ultimately he still is a tyrant.
Yeah, I mean that's. I mean, he is a poet after all. He's trying to create a a nice poetic package.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's important that Simonides is a professional manipulator of reputation and the rest of it. I mean, he's no more a neutral or somehow abstractedly wise figure than Hierone is. They are both defined by who they are.
But I think it's significant that Simonides is introduced as a wise man, and he is he's very much the wise advisor. So
sure. I mean, he's a different type of he's a different type of person from Hierone, certainly, but he is the type he is.
Yeah.
And that is a poetic servant who can kind of speak truth to power, but only up to a point, and only when power is in a good mood, because power has just won a victory. I mean, you can get away with stuff in that sort of context that is not that ordinary people can't. And at least at that level, that it's Simonides who talks to Hierone and not some other sort of person is kind of well chosen. I think he has the best chance.
Yeah, and I think it's very similar to what we find in Pindar in many ways. And if we had more Simonides, I think we would see.
Well, I mean, we would find possibly lots of intertexts. I don't know, but certainly, yes, reading Pindar is at least a kind of gets you in the right mood, so to speak.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it was interesting discussion.
Thank you. We have time for a question or two. So if you want to ask our speaker something or share a comment or a reflection, please do.
I fear everyone probably wants some dinner, but
well, if I might make one short remark. While Plato described, as it were, the form of a tyrant, he himself had certain tyrannical tendencies. For example, if you look at in the laws, at the way in which citizens of his new colony controlled in their foreign travel, that they're prevented from traveling abroad except with the permission of the government and for very specific purposes, so that they shouldn't even know what's going on in the rest of the world. This is actually the very model of how the Soviet Union and its satellites controlled foreign travel, as I think people in Poland could well remember it. I mean, they're precisely to prevent people from realizing what was going on in the rest of the world, and they're not living in such a paradise. Of course, it didn't work in some places like East Germany, where they could watch West German television. But the model, I think Plato provided the model in the laws exactly for the control of foreign travel used by the Soviet Union and its satellites.
Yes, absolutely, and I think it's interesting that in book 4 of the laws, essentially what the Athenian wants to put his regime in place is a tyrant. Although he says, I want a young tyrant who's good at learning, so someone who has the power to make the changes that he needs, but also can be influenced in the same way that Hieron in Xenophon's dialogue can be influenced for the good. So I think, yeah, we've got the king that Plato is thinking of is a ruler who is in a sense totalitarian and has power, but is forming people for the best rather than for his own benefit. So yes, I think that there definitely are similarities there.
Okay, so I think we have time for one more question if there is any. Okay, well, I'm seeing some hand raised, but where is it? No. Okay, so we will wrap up. I think I will ask just one final question again about Plato. I mean, famously, Karl Popper in his The Open Society and Its Enemies presented Plato's vision of the ideal politeia in the Republic as an insane totalitarian tyranny, and so I would like to ask half seriously whether let's assume that Plato really believed that it should be realized. I mean, his ideal state, it should be realized in a real place. Would it fulfill your criteria of tyrannis, Plato's ideal state?
I mean, yes, I think it possibly would, although in a sense it wouldn't be quite a tyranny, because these would be people selected as part of it's more of a sort of oligarchy, really, a group of people selected and educated in the same way, and so it's you've got an elite which is not based around one single family. So I think it would be slightly different on that basis. But also I do wonder whether Plato did actually ever consider, although Socrates, of course, emphasizes that, you know, this rule of philosophers could come about. I think there are enough indications that it's all the ideal government would only come about with divine help. That it would be a sort of divine moment that would bring everything we needed together into the ideal city. And also, I think there are indications as well where, you know, the meeting of Plato and Dion, for example, in Plutarch says, and also I think this reflects also what is in the seventh letter, is said to come about because of divine chance, that the meeting of these two. So I think it's very unlikely that any of this, in the same way that I think that Plato, if he had to live in the Callipolis, would not like not having enough poetry, because his writing is so suffused with poetry and the poetic song traditions of and with such variety as well, and such detail, that I find it incredible to think that he would want to live in a state that drove out the poets. But that's just my. I'm going to end with a controversial statement there. But if
thank you. But we are coming around to the same idea. I mean, we don't really love tyranny, even though, as you mentioned, there were some people, and certainly there are some people who seem to love to be ruled by tyrants. But it's maybe it's not a rule. Hopefully, so thank you again, Edmund, for the lecture. Thank you everyone for questions, discussion, from being here. And I will announce the next our next lecture, which will be given on the 17th of November. I will send out the information on the 17th of November. It's Wednesday, the same hour, and will be given by Professor Edward Harris, Professor Emeritus at Durham University, and it will be titled The Origin of Tyranny as a Political Slogan and the Rise of Freedom and the Rule of Law. So we will see each other in 2 weeks, hopefully. And thank you again. I wish you very good evening, night, or morning, or afternoon, wherever and whenever you are. See you.
Thanks all. Goodbye.